Wyoming Territory, 1875. The first snow of winter had begun to fall, dusting the rolling foothills of the Bighorn Mountains with a thin white blanket that muffled the sounds of the frontier. Quentin Vance stood on the porch of his small ranch house, watching the flakes dance in the chilly air as the sun dipped below the western horizon. At 26, Quentin had already seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes. The war, the lawlessness that followed, and the unforgiving nature of the frontier had taught him one immutable truth: a man survived longer when he kept to himself. "No use getting attached to anything out here," he muttered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Or anyone." His ranch, modest though it was, represented everything he had worked for since coming west after the war. 500 acres, a small herd of cattle, 2 good horses, and a cabin he had built with his own hands. It was lonely work, but loneliness was safer than the alternative. Every person he had ever cared for had either died or left him. His parents to fever, his brother to Confederate bullets, and the few friends he had made since then to the bottle, to outlaws, or to the endless wanderlust that seemed to infect men in these parts. The fading light caught on something moving in the distance, a wagon traveling slow along the road that passed by his property. Unusual to see travelers this time of year, especially with snow beginning to fall. Most folks with sense would have found shelter before nightfall. Quentin narrowed his eyes, trying to make out details through the growing darkness. The wagon seemed to be struggling, listing to one side. As it drew closer, he could see a single figure on the driver's bench, hunched against the cold. A woman, alone. Everything in him said to go inside, close the door, and let whatever troubles accompanied that wagon pass him by. The frontier was merciless to those who involved themselves in others' problems. Yet he remained on the porch, watching as the wagon limped closer. When it was clear the vehicle would pass right by his property, something made him step off the porch and walk toward the fence line. The wagon slowed as it approached, and Quentin got his first clear look at the driver. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with pale skin flushed from the cold. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever pins once held it, whipping around her face in the wind. She wore a wedding dress of all things, though it was smudged with dirt and torn at the hem. No coat, no gloves, just a thin shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. "Evening, ma'am," Quentin called, tipping his hat. "You're a fair piece from town, in weather that's turning ugly." The woman startled at his voice, as though she hadn't noticed him until he spoke. When she turned to look at him, Quentin saw eyes the color of a summer sky, rimmed red from crying. "I'm afraid I'm a fair piece from anywhere that matters," she replied, her voice carrying a slight tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. As if on cue, the wheel that had been wobbling gave way entirely, collapsing under the wagon with a crack like gunfire. The vehicle lurched sickeningly to the side, nearly throwing the woman from her seat. Quentin was moving before he could think better of it, vaulting the fence and rushing to steady the tilting wagon. The woman had managed to keep her seat, but now sat frozen, knuckles white where she gripped the bench. "That wheel's done for," Quentin said, examining the splintered wood. "You won't make it another mile like this." The woman looked down at him, desperation clear on her face. "I have to keep moving. I can't." Her voice broke, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. Quentin glanced at the darkening sky. The snow was falling faster now, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. Whatever this woman's situation, she wouldn't survive a night in the open. "My ranch is just there," he said, gesturing to his cabin. "You can shelter for the night. Tomorrow I can help fix your wheel or take you into town if that's where you're headed." She hesitated, looking from Quentin to the cabin and back again, clearly weighing her limited options. "I don't make a habit of inviting strangers to stay," Quentin added, "but I make an exception for folks about to freeze to death, especially ones wearing wedding dresses in a snowstorm." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there, and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "I'm Zaida," she said after a moment, "Zaida Monroe." "Quentin Vance," he replied. "Let's get you inside before this snow gets worse." They unhitched the horse from the wagon, and Quentin led it toward his small stable, while Zaida collected a carpet bag from the wagon. As they walked the short distance to his cabin, Quentin couldn't help but notice how ill-prepared she was for travel, much less winter travel. The wedding dress, beautiful as it must have been before whatever journey had brought her here, offered little protection from the elements. Inside, the cabin was plain but neat. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with a modest kitchen area opposite. A table with 2 chairs stood in the center, and a curtain separated what must be a sleeping area from the main room. "It's not much," Quentin said as he stoked the fire, suddenly aware of how sparse his home must appear to a visitor. "It's warm," Zaida replied simply, moving closer to the flames. In the firelight, Quentin could see her more clearly. She was beautiful in a delicate way, with high cheekbones and full lips currently blue-tinged from cold. Her wedding dress, despite its bedraggled state, was clearly expensive, with intricate beadwork across the bodice. "I've got some clothes that might fit you," Quentin offered, moving toward a chest near his bed. "Nothing fancy, but dry at least." He returned with a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that would be too large but could be cinched with a belt. Zaida accepted them with murmured thanks. "I'll step outside while you change," he said, already heading for the door. "Wait," Zaida called. When he turned, she was clutching the clothes to her chest, looking uncertain. "Thank you for helping me. Most would have let me pass by." Quentin nodded once, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." Her smile was sad. "No, Mr. Vance, they wouldn't have." Outside, Quentin leaned against the porch railing and watched the snow fall. What was he doing, bringing a strange woman into his home? A woman clearly running from something or someone, if her wedding dress and the tears were any indication. This was precisely the kind of entanglement he had spent years avoiding. Tomorrow he would fix her wagon wheel and send her on her way, before whatever trouble followed her caught up. When he returned inside, Zaida had changed into his clothes, which swallowed her slender frame. She had found a length of rope to use as a belt and had rolled up the sleeves and pant legs. She sat by the fire, her wedding dress draped over a chair to dry. "I can make some coffee," Quentin offered, moving to the stove. "And there's stew left from earlier." "I don't want to impose more than I already have," Zaida began, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. Quentin raised an eyebrow. "When did you last eat?" Zaida hesitated. "Yesterday morning, I think." Without another word, Quentin set about warming the stew and brewing coffee. As he worked, the silence between them grew, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the soft howl of wind outside. "Most folks getting married don't end up alone in a snowstorm wearing their wedding dress," he finally said, setting a bowl of stew and a cup of coffee before her. "Unless I've been doing it wrong all these years." That earned him a small laugh, though it held little humor. "You've been doing it right by not doing it at all, I suspect." Zaida took a sip of coffee, closing her eyes briefly at the warmth. "I was to be married today. To the son of the most prominent rancher in the county." "Hale Monroe," Quentin supplied, recognition dawning. "You're to marry Wallace Monroe's boy." "I was," Zaida corrected, staring into her coffee. "Until I arrived at the church and discovered he had married my cousin the day before." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Apparently, they had been in love for months. "They decided to tell me on my wedding day, in front of half the county." Quentin winced. "That's a special kind of cruelty." "The worst part was everyone looking at me with such pity," Zaida continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "All those people watching me stand there in my wedding dress while the man I was supposed to marry told me he had chosen someone else. Someone in my own family." She looked up, blue eyes fierce despite the tears that threatened. "So I took the wagon we were meant to leave in after the ceremony and just drove. I couldn't stay there, not with everyone knowing, not with them looking at me like that." "Where were you heading?" Quentin asked, taking the chair across from her. Zaida laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "I have absolutely no idea. I just knew I had to get away." She set down her coffee cup. "I'm 20 years old, Mr. Vance, and until today my entire life has been planned for me. Where I would live, who I would marry, what my future would hold. Now none of that is true, and I find myself with no plans at all." Quentin nodded slowly. "Sometimes no plan is better than a bad one." I suppose I'll find out, Zaida said, returning to her stew. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the howling wind outside and the occasional pop from the fireplace. When they finished, Quentin cleared the dishes and prepared a makeshift bed near the fire. "You take the bed," he said, gesturing toward the curtained area. "I'll sleep out here." Zaida began to protest, but Quentin held up a hand. "I've slept in worse places than my own floor, Miss Monroe. The bed's yours." She thanked him again, disappearing behind the curtain. Quentin settled onto his pallet near the fire, listening to the wind outside. It had been a long time since another person had been in his home, longer still since that person had been a woman. The quiet of his solitary existence had been broken, if only for a night, and Quentin was surprised to find he didn't mind as much as he should have. Tomorrow he would fix her wagon and send her on her way. Tomorrow his life would return to normal. Tonight he would try not to think about blue eyes rimmed with tears or the strange, unwelcome feeling that had settled in his chest when she'd smiled. Quentin woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in his kitchen. For a disorienting moment he couldn't place the sounds, so accustomed was he to waking in silence. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back. Zaida stood at his stove, still wearing his clothes, her dark hair braided neatly down her back. She looked up as he sat up, offering a tentative smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the pot of coffee and the pan of biscuits she had apparently found the ingredients to make. "I wanted to thank you for your hospitality." "No need for thanks," Quentin replied, rising and folding the blankets he had used. "But coffee is always welcome." They shared a breakfast of biscuits and the last of his bacon, the conversation easier than it had been the night before. Zaida in the light of day seemed less fragile, though no less adrift. When they finished eating, Quentin pulled on his coat. "Let's take a look at that wagon," he said. "Snow's stopped for now, but it'll start again before nightfall." Outside, the world was transformed by a blanket of white that sparkled in the morning sun. Quentin examined the broken wheel with a critical eye. The damage was worse than he had initially thought. Several spokes were broken and the rim had split. "This needs more than a quick fix," he said, straightening. "I'd have to replace most of it, and I don't have the right materials here." Zaida's face fell. "How far is it to town?" 5 miles to Medicine Creek," Quentin replied. "But the wagon's not going anywhere on 3 wheels, and the snow's too deep now for a horse to pull it without getting stuck." "I could walk," Zaida suggested, though she looked doubtful as she surveyed the snow-covered landscape. Quentin shook his head. "Not in this weather, not without proper gear," he sighed, already regretting what he was about to say. "You'll have to stay until the weather clears, then I can take you to town on horseback." Relief and uncertainty warred on Zaida's face. "I've imposed enough already." "It's not an imposition if it keeps you from freezing to death," Quentin replied dryly. "Besides, it's not like I have pressing social engagements." That earned him a genuine smile, transforming her face from merely pretty to breathtaking. Quentin looked away, suddenly fascinated by the broken wagon wheel. "If I'm to stay, I insist on helping," Zaida said. "I can cook, clean, mend, whatever would be useful." Quentin nodded, not trusting himself to speak for a moment. "That's fair," he finally managed. "Come on, let's get back inside before we both freeze." The next 3 days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Quentin tended to his cattle and horses, chopped firewood, and handled the other endless tasks that came with maintaining a ranch. Zaida took over the cooking and helped with whatever chores she could, proving herself both capable and determined despite her obvious inexperience with ranch life. On the 4th day, Quentin returned from the barn to find Zaida sitting at the table, carefully mending a tear in one of his shirts. She had found a needle and thread somewhere, and her stitches were small and neat. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" he asked, hanging his coat by the door. Zaida looked up, her expression unreadable. "My mother insisted I learn all the proper wifely arts, sewing, cooking, managing a household." She set down the shirt. "I was raised to be an ornament and a helpmate, Mr. Vance. Not much use for anything else." Quentin leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "And what would you rather be?" The question seemed to surprise her, I've never been asked that before. She thought for a moment, absently running her fingers along the mended seam. I think I'd like to be useful, really useful, not just decorative, to build something of my own. Like what? Zaida smiled a bit sadly. That's the trouble, I don't know what I'm good for besides being someone's wife. That's all I was ever meant to be. Seems to me you're good at figuring things out, Quentin said. You've taken to ranch work better than most city folks would. Is that a compliment, Mr. Vance? Zaida teased, her eyes brightening. Just an observation, he replied, though he couldn't help the smile that tugged at his lips. And I think after 4 days of you living in my house, you might as well call me Quentin. Quentin, she repeated, as if testing the feel of it. Then you must call me Zaida. Something shifted between them in that moment, a barrier lowered. Quentin found himself watching her more than he should as she moved around his kitchen, noticing the graceful way she worked and the quiet determination with which she approached each task. That night as they sat by the fire after dinner, Zaida asked about his life before the ranch. Not much to tell, Quentin said, staring into the flames. Fought in the war, came west afterward. Worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army. Saved enough to buy this place 3 years ago. Family, Zaida pressed gently. None left, Quentin replied, his voice flat. Lost my parents to fever when I was 16. My brother died at Antietam. Zaida was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she finally said. Loss leaves hollows in us that never quite fill again. Quentin looked at her, surprised by the insight. You've lost people too. She nodded. My father when I was 12. My mother remarried quickly, she wasn't built for being alone. Zaida's gaze grew distant. My stepfather was, not kind, but he was wealthy and connected. The marriage to Hale was his arrangement, a business transaction more than a union. Did you love him, Hale? Quentin asked, immediately regretting the question when pain flashed across her face. I thought I did, Zaida admitted. Or I convinced myself I could. He was handsome, charming when he wanted to be, and it was what everyone expected, she sighed. But no, I don't think I really loved him. I loved the idea of him, of escape, of having my own household away from my stepfather's control. Quentin nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. The frontier makes for strange bedfellows. People attach themselves to whatever promises safety or escape. Is that why you're alone? Zaida asked, her eyes searching his face. Because attachment is too dangerous. The question hit too close to the truth for comfort. Quentin stood abruptly, moving to add another log to the fire. It's getting late, he said, avoiding her gaze. We should turn in. He felt her watching him, but she didn't press further. Of course, she said quietly. Good night, Quentin. Long after she had gone to bed, Quentin sat by the fire, troubled by the conversation and by his growing awareness of Zaida's presence in his home, in his life. He had spent years cultivating solitude, convincing himself it was safer, better. Yet in just a few days, this woman had slipped past defenses he hadn't even realized were there. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would take her to town, regardless of the weather. Before whatever was happening between them had a chance to take root, the next morning dawned clear and cold. Quentin rose early, determined to make good on his resolution. He was saddling his horse when Zaida found him in the barn, already dressed in her own clothes, the wedding dress which she had somehow managed to clean and mend. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Quentin nodded, not looking up from the saddle girth he was tightening. Weather's clear, best time to get you to town. I see, her voice was carefully neutral. Quentin finally looked at her, standing in the doorway with sunlight catching in her dark hair. Something tightened in his chest at the sight. You'll be better off in town, he said, more gruffly than he intended. You can find proper work there, maybe passage to somewhere else if that's what you want. And if that's not what I want, Zaida asked quietly. What else is there? Quentin countered, though he knew the answer as soon as the words left his mouth. Zaida took a step forward, her blue eyes intent on his face. I could stay here. Quentin shook his head, turning back to his horse. This is no place for someone like you. It's hard country, lonely work. I'm stronger than I look, Zaida insisted, moving closer still. And I've known loneliness in crowded rooms full of people who claim to care for me. At least here the solitude is honest. You barely know me, Quentin said, though his resolve was weakening by the second. I know enough, Zaida replied simply. I know you're a good man. I know you work hard and live honestly. I know you've been hurt enough to wall yourself away from the world. She paused, her voice softening. And I know that in the past 5 days, I've felt more at home in your quiet cabin than I ever did in my stepfather's mansion. Quentin turned to face her fully, his heart hammering against his ribs. What are you saying, exactly? I'm saying I don't want to go to town, Zaida said, her cheeks flushing but her gaze steady. Not yet, I'm asking if I can stay, as your housekeeper if nothing else. I'll earn my keep. It was a reasonable request, a practical arrangement, yet they both knew it was more than that or could be, given time. This isn't the life you were meant for, Quentin said, a last, weak protest. Zaida smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and took his breath away. Maybe it's exactly the life I was meant for, but never knew to want. Before Quentin could respond, a sound outside caught their attention, horses approaching at speed. He moved past Zaida to the barn door, peering out at the riders coming up the road toward his ranch. 4 men, well-mounted and well-armed, and in the lead, a face Quentin recognized from town meetings and cattle auctions. Wallace Monroe, Hale's father and one of the most powerful men in the territory. It's your father-in-law, Quentin said, turning back to Zaida, or would-be father-in-law. The color drained from Zaida's face. He's found me. How would he know to look here? Quentin asked, already reaching for the rifle he kept mounted on the barn wall. Someone must have seen the wagon, Zaida said, her voice tight with fear. Quentin, you don't understand. Wallace Monroe isn't just angry I ran off. The marriage contract my stepfather signed included property that was part of my mother's dowry, land that borders Monroe's ranch. Without the marriage, that land reverts to me when I turn 21 next month. Understanding dawned, land that Monroe wants. Zaida nodded grimly, land he'll do anything to get. The riders were nearly at the fence line now. Quentin could see Monroe's face clearly, ruddy with cold or anger or both, his expression thunderous. Stay here, Quentin told Zaida, checking that his rifle was loaded. If things go bad, there's a back door. Take my horse and ride west. There's a line shack about 3 miles over the ridge. Wait there for me. I'm not leaving you to face them alone, Zaida protested. Quentin shook his head. This isn't your fight. It's precisely my fight, Zaida insisted, her chin lifting in defiance. And I won't have you hurt because of me. Before Quentin could argue further, Monroe's voice boomed across the yard. Vance, I know you're in there, and I know you've got my son's bride hiding in your barn. Quentin exchanged a look with Zaida, who had gone pale but stood straight, her fear controlled. Stay behind me, he murmured, then stepped out of the barn, rifle held ready but not aimed. Monroe sat his horse at the gate, flanked by 3 men who had the hard look of hired guns rather than ranch hands. All were armed, hands resting casually near holstered pistols. Morning, Monroe, Quentin called, his tone deliberately casual. What brings you out this way? Monroe's eyes narrowed. Don't play dumb with me, boy. I know Zaida Monroe is here, her wagon sitting right there in plain sight. Miss Monroe's wagon broke down in the snowstorm, Quentin replied evenly. I offered shelter. How gallant, Monroe sneered. Well, your hospitality is no longer needed. I've come to take her home. I'm afraid Miss Monroe has other plans, Quentin said, aware of Zaida moving to stand beside him despite his instructions to stay back. Monroe's face darkened when he saw her. There you are, girl, you've caused quite a stir running off like that. Your stepfather is beside himself with worry. I doubt that very much, Zaida replied, her voice steady despite the slight tremor Quentin could feel where her arm pressed against his. As I'm sure you know, my marriage to Hale is no longer possible, given his new wife. I'll be returning to town shortly to make arrangements for my future. Your future was decided when your stepfather signed the marriage contract, Monroe said, his pretense of concern dropping away. That contract included the transfer of certain properties upon your marriage to any member of the Monroe family. Any member, Quentin repeated, disgust coloring his tone. So when your son married someone else, you what? Planned to marry her yourself, or perhaps one of your other sons. Monroe's expression confirmed the accusation. The girl needs a husband, and my family needs that land. It's a fair arrangement. It's an arrangement I never agreed to, Zaida said, her voice stronger now. And as I'll be of age next month, I have no intention of honoring a contract I never signed. Monroe's hand dropped to his gun. I'm afraid I can't allow that. That land completes my holdings and gives me control of the water rights for the entire valley. I've worked too long to let it slip away because of a willful girl. Quentin shifted slightly, putting himself more firmly between Zaida and the armed men. I think it's time you left, Monroe. Miss Monroe has made her position clear. One of Monroe's men moved his horse forward, his hand on his pistol. Boss said the girl is coming with us. One way or another. Quentin raised his rifle, not pointing it directly at anyone yet, but the threat clear. And I said she's not. Now this can end with all of us walking away, or it can end with blood on the snow. Your choice. For a tense moment, no one moved. Quentin could feel his heart hammering in his chest, acutely aware that he was outnumbered and likely outgunned. But he had faced worse odds in the war and come through. If it came to shooting, he'd make sure Zaida had time to get away. Monroe broke the silence with a harsh laugh. You're willing to die for her, a woman you've known less than a week. A woman promised to another man. She's not promised to anyone, Quentin replied steadily, and I'd die to protect any innocent from men like you. She's coming with us, Vance, Monroe said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. The only question is whether you'll be alive to see her go. The tension stretched, taut as a bowstring. Quentin's finger moved to the trigger, calculating which of Monroe's men posed the biggest threat, which he'd have to take down first. Then unexpectedly Zaida stepped forward. Wait, she said, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. There's no need for violence. Quentin started to protest, but Zaida silenced him with a look. Mister Monroe, she continued, turning to face the older man, you want my land, I understand that. But killing Quentin won't get it for you. In fact, it will ensure you never get it. Monroe frowned, his hand still on his gun. What are you suggesting? A compromise, Zaida said. I'll sell you the water rights you want for a fair price, but the land remains mine. Monroe's eyes narrowed. And why would I agree to that when I can simply take what I want? Because if anything happens to me or to Quentin, I've arranged for all documentation regarding the land to be sent to the territorial governor, Zaida bluffed smoothly. Along with details of this meeting and your threats. I imagine that would cause quite a scandal, the great Wallace Monroe implicated in murder over a land dispute. Quentin stared at her, impressed by the quick thinking even as he worried it wouldn't be enough to deter Monroe. Monroe's face had gone an ugly shade of red. You're lying. Am I? Zaida challenged. Are you willing to risk your reputation, your freedom on that assumption? For a long moment Monroe glared at her, calculation clear in his eyes. Finally, he removed his hand from his gun. Water rights aren't enough, he said. I want a right-of-way through the property as well. For moving my cattle to market. Limited access during specific times of year along a designated route, Zaida countered. To be negotiated in writing with witnesses present. Monroe's jaw worked as he considered. Fine, he finally spat, but this isn't over, girl, not by a long shot. He turned his furious gaze to Quentin. And you'd best watch your back. The frontier has a way of swallowing up men who don't mind their own business. With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following close behind. Quentin and Zaida stood watching until they disappeared from sight. That was quite a bluff, Quentin said when they were alone again. Zaida's shoulders sagged, the tension visibly draining from her. I had to do something. He was going to kill you. How did you know he'd back down? I didn't, Zaida admitted, looking up at him with eyes still wide from fear. but men like Monroe care about their reputations above all else. It was the only weapon I had. Quentin shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. You're either the bravest or the most foolish woman I've ever met. Perhaps both, Zaida replied, returning his smile despite the trembling that had begun in her hands. Quentin, I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to your door. You were right, I should go to town. I can't put you at risk like this. No, Quentin said, the word coming out more forcefully than he intended. He set down his rifle, turning to face her fully. No, he repeated more gently. Monroe was right about one thing, this isn't over. He'll try again, maybe not with guns next time, but he won't give up what he wants. All the more reason for me to leave, Zaida insisted. Quentin took her hands, stilling their trembling with his warmth. All the more reason for you to stay, he corrected, at least until we figure out how to deal with Monroe permanently. We, Zaida asked, her voice small. We, Quentin confirmed, suddenly certain. I meant what I said to Monroe. I protect innocent people from men like him, always have. He paused, struggling to find the right words. But this is different, you're different. Different how? Zaida pressed, her eyes searching his face. Quentin took a deep breath. I've spent years convincing myself that being alone was safer. That caring for people only led to losing them. But these past days with you, he trailed off, the words failing him. Yes, Zaida encouraged, her hands tightening around his. These past days have made me remember what it's like to not be alone, Quentin finally managed. And I find I don't want to go back to how things were before you arrived. A slow smile spread across Zaida's face, transforming it. I don't want that either. The confession hung between them, fragile and new. Quentin was acutely aware of her hands in his, of her face turned up to his, of the way the sunlight caught in her hair. So you'll stay, he asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so simple. I'll stay, Zaida confirmed, though I warn you I'm still a terrible cook. Quentin laughed, the sound strange to his own ears after so long. We'll manage. And as they walked back to the cabin together, Quentin felt something shift inside him. A wall crumbling, a door opening to possibilities he had long ago decided weren't meant for men like him. The frontier was still dangerous, Monroe was still a threat, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in years, he wasn't facing it alone. Over the next 2 weeks, Zaida settled into life at the ranch as if she had always been there. She learned quickly, proving adept at tasks Quentin would never have expected from a woman raised in luxury, mending fences, tending chickens, even helping with the cattle when needed. In the evenings they sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, the silences between them comfortable rather than strained. Quentin found himself watching her often, the determined set of her jaw when she tackled a difficult task, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the graceful movements of her hands as she worked. Each day, the feelings growing inside him became harder to deny or ignore. They had carefully avoided discussing what would happen when the immediate danger from Monroe passed. The unspoken understanding between them felt too fragile, too new to withstand direct examination. Instead, they existed in a strange limbo, neither acknowledging nor denying the tension that hummed between them whenever their hands accidentally touched or their eyes met for too long. One evening, as Zaida mended a shirt by the fire, Quentin finally broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "We need to go to town," he said, "to file paperwork about your land and make the agreement with Monroe official. The sooner it's legally documented, the safer you'll be." Zaida nodded, not looking up from her stitching. "You're right, and I should wire my aunt in Boston. She'll worry when she hears about what happened with Hale." "Boston," Quentin repeated, something cold settling in his stomach. "Is that where you'll go when this is settled?" Now Zaida did look up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Do you want me to go to Boston?" "No," Quentin said too quickly. He cleared his throat. "I mean that's for you to decide. You have options now." "Options?" Zaida echoed, setting aside her mending. "Yes, I suppose I do, more than I've ever had before." She studied his face. "What would you have me do, Quentin?" It was a direct question, one he couldn't evade. Quentin stood, moving to the fireplace, buying time as he added another log to the flames. "I'd have you do whatever brings you happiness," he finally said, not looking at her. "You deserve that much after everything you've been through." "And if what would make me happy is staying here?" Zaida asked, her voice soft but steady. Quentin turned to face her, his heart hammering. "Here on the ranch. Or here in Wyoming Territory." "Here," Zaida said simply, "with you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back or ignore. Quentin crossed the room slowly, coming to stand before her chair. "I have nothing to offer you," he said, his voice rough. "No wealth, no position, just a small ranch and hard work until the day I die." "You offer honesty," Zaida countered, rising to face him. "Respect, safety. Those are worth more than all the wealth and position my stepfather's world offered." "Zaida," Quentin began, then stopped, unsure what to say next. How could he explain that he wanted her to stay more than he had wanted anything in years, but feared he was being selfish for wishing it? "I know this is sudden," Zaida said, misinterpreting his hesitation. "We've known each other such a short time, and I know my presence here complicates your life in ways you never asked for. If you want me to go—" "No," Quentin interrupted, taking her hands in his. "That's not it at all. I want you to stay. God help me, I want it more than is reasonable or wise." He took a deep breath. "But I need to know you're choosing this, choosing me for the right reasons, not out of gratitude or fear or lack of options." Zaida's eyes softened. "Quentin Vance," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "For a man so observant about most things, you can be remarkably blind." Before he could respond, she leaned up and pressed her lips to his, a brief, sweet kiss that nonetheless stole his breath. "I'm choosing you," she said as she pulled away, her cheeks flushed but her gaze direct. "Not out of gratitude or fear or desperation, but because in the short time I've known you, you've shown me what kind of man you are. And that's the kind of man I want to build a life with, if you'll have me." For a moment, Quentin could only stare at her, overwhelmed by the certainty in her voice, the openness of her expression. Then he pulled her close and kissed her properly, deeply, thoroughly, trying to convey with actions what he struggled to express in words. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I'll have you," he said softly, "for as long as you'll stay." "Then prepare for a very long time indeed," Zaida replied, her smile lighting her entire face. The next morning they rode into town together. Medicine Creek was little more than a single street lined with the essential businesses of frontier life: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and the sheriff's office. People stared as they rode in, whispers following in their wake. News of Zaida's jilting and subsequent disappearance had clearly spread. Their first stop was the land office, where Zaida filed documentation claiming her property rights. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked nervous when she mentioned Wallace Monroe's name, but recorded everything properly. "You'll want to be careful, miss," he warned as they prepared to leave. "Monroe doesn't take kindly to being thwarted." "We're aware," Quentin replied, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. They had just stepped out onto the boardwalk when a voice called Zaida's name. Turning, they saw a well-dressed older man hurrying toward them, his expression a mixture of relief and anger. "Your stepfather," Zaida murmured to Quentin, her body tensing beside his. George Terrell was a tall man with iron-gray hair and cold eyes that assessed Quentin with obvious disapproval before turning to Zaida. "Thank God you've been found," he said, reaching for her arm. "Your behavior has been utterly disgraceful, running away like a child, hiding out with—" he looked Quentin up and down, "this person. We're going home immediately." Zaida stepped back out of his reach. "No, we're not. I'm not going anywhere with you." Terrell's face darkened. "Don't be ridiculous, Zaida. You have responsibilities, obligations. The scandal you've already caused is bad enough without adding to it by consorting with some frontier nobody." "This frontier nobody has a name," Quentin said, his voice deceptively calm. "Quentin Vance, and Miss Monroe isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Terrell ignored him entirely, focusing on Zaida. Monroe has informed me of your little tantrum over the marriage. While it's unfortunate that Hale chose poorly, arrangements can still be made with one of his brothers. The land transfer must proceed as planned. The land is mine, Zaida said firmly. As of an hour ago, it's legally recorded in my name. I've agreed to sell water rights to the Monroe Ranch, but the property remains mine to do with as I please. You stupid girl, Terrell hissed, grabbing for her arm again. Do you have any idea what's at stake? The money involved. I didn't raise you to throw away your future on some romantic nonsense. Quentin stepped between them, his hand closing around Terrell's wrist. Touch her again, he said quietly, and you'll lose that hand. For a tense moment the two men stared at each other. Then Terrell yanked his arm free, his face contorted with rage. This isn't over, he spat. You're still under my legal guardianship for another month, Zaida. Plenty of time to have this cowboy arrested for abduction and to undo whatever foolish legal maneuvers you've attempted. Actually, came a new voice, that's not quite accurate. They all turned to see an elderly man in a neat suit approaching. He held a leather portfolio and regarded the scene with shrewd eyes. Judge Peterson, Zaida said, recognition and relief in her voice. The judge nodded to her before addressing Terrell. As I was saying, your legal guardianship is in question, Mr. Terrell. It seems there are irregularities in how you assumed control of Miss Monroe's inheritance after her mother's death. Irregularities I've been investigating for some time at the request of her maternal aunt. Terrell's face paled. What are you talking about? My wife left everything to me. Your wife left her personal property to you, the judge corrected. But Miss Monroe's inheritance from her father was held in trust to be managed by her mother until Miss Monroe came of age. When her mother died, that trust should have passed to the secondary trustee named in the will, her sister, Elizabeth Caldwell. Instead, you somehow convinced the court you were the rightful guardian. He paused, his expression severe. I've been in communication with Mrs. Caldwell. She's quite concerned about her niece and the management of her affairs. Zaida looked stunned. My aunt knows what's happening here. She's involved. Indeed, Judge Peterson confirmed. She's been trying to locate you for some time. When news reached her of your intended marriage to Hale Monroe, a match she knew you would never have chosen freely, she became quite alarmed. He smiled slightly. Mrs. Caldwell is a formidable woman with excellent connections. Once she explained her concerns, I was happy to assist in reviewing the legal documentation. Terrell's expression had moved from shock to calculation. This is absurd. A misunderstanding. Zaida, tell the judge you've been perfectly happy in my care. Zaida looked at her stepfather, then at Quentin, who stood solid and reassuring beside her. I was not happy, she said clearly. I was controlled, manipulated, and nearly forced into a marriage I didn't want for your financial benefit. And I suspect, if the trust's accounts are examined, other irregularities will be found. Terrell's face twisted with fury. You ungrateful little. That's quite enough, Mr. Terrell, the judge interrupted. I suggest you return to your hotel and prepare to answer some rather pointed questions about your management of Miss Monroe's inheritance. In the meantime, given the circumstances, I'm issuing an emergency order terminating your guardianship, effective immediately. He turned to Zaida. Miss Monroe, you are free to make your own decisions regarding your person and property until your birthday, at which point you'll assume full legal control of your inheritance. Zaida swayed slightly, and Quentin put a steadying hand on her back. Thank you, Judge Peterson, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. The judge nodded, then turned a speculative eye to Quentin. And you, young man, what is your interest in this matter? Before Quentin could answer, Terrell snapped. He's after her money, obviously. Some fortune-hunting drifter who saw an opportunity. Mr. Vance owns his own ranch, Zaida said sharply. He offered me shelter when I had nowhere to go, protected me when Monroe threatened me, and has asked for nothing in return. He is a good man, which is more than I can say for you, stepfather. Judge Peterson looked between them, assessment in his gaze. I see, he said finally. Well, Miss Monroe, as I said, you're free to make your own decisions now. though I would caution against any hasty ones. Your aunt would very much like to see you, and there are matters regarding your inheritance that require attention." "Of course," Zaida agreed. "I would like to see my aunt as well. It's been too long." With a final nod, the judge departed, leaving the three of them standing on the boardwalk. Terrell glared at Zaida, then at Quentin. "This isn't finished," he warned. "You'll regret crossing me, both of you." With that, he stormed off toward the hotel. Zaida let out a shaky breath, leaning against Quentin. "I can't believe it," she murmured. "All this time my aunt was trying to help me, and the trust, I knew my father had left me something, but stepfather always said it was minimal, just enough for a modest dowry." "Doesn't sound like your stepfather is the honest type," Quentin observed dryly. "I'd wager there's quite a bit more than a modest dowry waiting for you." Zaida looked up at him, suddenly worried. "Does that change things between us?" Quentin considered the question seriously. The prospect of Zaida being wealthy complicated matters in ways he hadn't anticipated. Would people assume, as Terrell had, that he was after her money? Would she herself come to believe it once she was established in her new position? "It changes things," he admitted finally. "But not in the way you're thinking. I don't want your money, Zaida, I never did, but your inheritance means you have choices now, real choices. You could go anywhere, do anything." He paused, forcing himself to say the words. "You don't need me or my protection anymore." Understanding dawned in Zaida's eyes. "You think I'll leave now that I have options?" "Wouldn't you?" "Should you?" Quentin asked, his voice rough. "What can I offer that compares to the life you could have? You could travel, study, live in a fine house in a real city." Zaida was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dusty street of Medicine Creek, at the mountains in the distance, at the vast openness of the Wyoming sky. Then she turned back to Quentin, her expression resolved. "I could do those things," she agreed, "and perhaps someday I will visit cities and see other places, but not to live, not permanently." She took his hands in hers. "What you offer, Quentin Vance, is something no amount of money can buy. A home. Not just a house, but a true home with someone who sees me for who I am, not what I own or represent." She smiled, a bit tremulously. "That is, if you still want me, now that I come with complications." Quentin pulled her closer, uncaring of the townspeople watching from doorways and windows. "I want you," he said, his voice low and certain. "Complications and all." He hesitated, then added, "But I think we should take some time, do things properly. You've just escaped one hasty arrangement. I don't want to rush you into another, even if it's one you choose freely." Zaida's smile widened. "Are you suggesting a courtship, Mr. Vance?" "I'm suggesting we take the time to be sure," Quentin replied, though his eyes betrayed his feelings more clearly than words could. "You get to know your inheritance, your aunt. I get my ranch in better order, and we see where we stand when the dust settles." "Very sensible," Zaida agreed, her eyes twinkling. "Though I should warn you, I already know where I stand." Quentin smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "So do I," he admitted, "but I can be patient." Over the following months, Zaida split her time between Medicine Creek, where she stayed in the small hotel while handling her legal affairs, and Quentin's ranch, where she continued to learn the rhythms of frontier life. Judge Peterson helped her navigate the complexities of her inheritance, which proved to be substantial: land holdings in several states, investments, and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Her Aunt Elizabeth arrived from Boston, a formidable woman with Zaida's blue eyes and a determination to see justice done. She took one look at Quentin and declared him a vast improvement over that Monroe boy, which Quentin took as high praise indeed. Wallace Monroe, faced with legal scrutiny and the loss of his anticipated land acquisition, grudgingly honored the agreement for water rights. George Terrell, finding himself under investigation for mismanagement of Zaida's trust, fled the territory, reportedly heading for California. Through it all, Quentin and Zaida's relationship deepened. He taught her to ride properly, to shoot a rifle, to predict weather from the way the wind shifted. She brought music and laughter to his cabin, filling empty spaces he hadn't realized were there. They took things slowly as promised, though their feelings grew stronger with each passing day. On her 21st birthday, Zaida officially took control of her inheritance. That evening she rode out to Quentin's ranch, their usual pattern now, spending evenings together before she returned to town for the night. But this time, she arrived with her carpet bag and a determined expression. "I've moved out of the hotel," she announced as she dismounted. "Aunt Elizabeth is returning to Boston next week, and I've decided it's time to settle permanently." Quentin, who had been mending a fence, set down his tools. "And where will you be settling?" he asked, his heart in his throat. Zaida looked around the ranch, at the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, at the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance, at the mountains rising against the sky. "Here," she said simply, "if you'll have me." Quentin crossed to her in a few long strides. "Are you proposing to me, Zaida Monroe?" he asked, trying and failing to keep the smile from his face. "I suppose I am," Zaida replied, her cheeks pink but her gaze steady. "Though it lacks romance, I admit." "I disagree," Quentin said, taking her hands in his. "But as it happens, I had plans of my own for today." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a ring, simple but beautifully crafted, with a small blue stone that matched her eyes. Zaida's breath caught. "Quentin." "I was going to ride into town tonight," he said, suddenly nervous. "Had a whole speech prepared about how I know I'm not worthy of you, but I love you enough to try to be, every day for the rest of my life." He shook his head, smiling ruefully. "You beat me to it." "I've always been impatient," Zaida said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But I like your speech better than mine." Quentin took a deep breath. "Zaida Monroe, I love you. I didn't believe love like this existed, especially not for men like me. But you proved me wrong, just as you've proven me wrong about so many things." He held out the ring. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Zaida said without hesitation. 1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in Medicine Creek's small church, with Judge Peterson officiating and Aunt Elizabeth beaming approval from the front pew. The entire town turned out for the occasion, drawn by curiosity and genuine affection for the couple who had defied Wallace Monroe and won. Zaida wore a simple dress of pale blue, not white. "I've had quite enough of white wedding dresses," she explained with a laugh. Quentin, in a new suit that felt strange after years of work clothes, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days, Quentin marveled at how completely his life had changed in the span of a few short months. The man who had believed love was a liability on the frontier had found in Zaida not weakness but strength, not vulnerability but resilience. They rode back to the ranch that evening as husband and wife, the future stretching before them like the vast Wyoming landscape, open, challenging, but beautiful beyond measure. The cabin that had once echoed with Quentin's solitude now hummed with shared dreams and plans. Expanding the ranch, building a larger house, perhaps someday filling it with children's laughter. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Zaida curled against his side, Quentin finally gave voice to the thought that had been circling in his mind for days. "I still can't quite believe you chose this," he said softly. "This life, this place, me." Zaida propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the dim light. "Do you know what I realized, that first night when my wagon broke down and you offered shelter? That kindness, real kindness, with no expectation of return, is the rarest thing in the world." She traced his jawline with gentle fingers. "You offered shelter to a rejected bride, Quentin Vance, but it was your heart I truly wanted. And now that I have it, I intend to keep it safe for all our days." Quentin pulled her close, overwhelmed by gratitude and love. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang around the corners of the cabin, carrying the promise of spring after the long winter. Inside, two people who had found in each other the home they had always sought held close against whatever storms might come, secure in the knowledge that some bonds, once forged in truth and tested by fire, would never break.